The words hit Elder Caleb Drummond like a slap across his weathered face, spoken low and cold enough to cut through the noise of the crowded saloon and silence every man within earshot. Monroe Hale did not raise his voice. He never needed to. He stood with his back half-turned to the bar, his right hand resting easy near the pearl-handled Colt at his hip, his dark eyes fixed on the old man with the kind of stillness that made seasoned drifters think twice about breathing too loud. The oil lamps overhead cast sharp shadows across the hard line of his jaw, and the whole room seemed to hold its breath. "She came to this valley with nothing," Monroe said again, slower this time, each word measured and deliberate, "and she owed nobody a single thing." Drummond's face had gone the color of old ash. He was a man accustomed to deference, a man whose word in Redemption Valley had carried the weight of law for the better part of 20 years. His white collar was pressed, his suit was clean, and his hands, folded over the head of his walking cane, were trembling. "Boy," Drummond said, and the word dripped with contempt, "you do not understand what you are defending." "I understand it fine." Monroe's eyes did not waver. "I understand that you called her a thief in front of 20 witnesses this morning. I understand that you threatened to have her removed from land she earned with her own hands. And I understand that everything you said was a lie constructed to steal what belongs to her." The room was absolutely silent now. Chairs had been pushed back. Hands were flat on tables. Even the bartender had stopped wiping glasses. Drummond leaned forward on his cane. "That woman has no deed, no husband, no name anyone in this county can verify. She is a ghost, and ghosts do not own property in Redemption Valley." Monroe's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Something moved behind his eyes, not anger, not exactly, but something older and more dangerous than anger. Something that looked like a man who had reached the edge of a very long patience. "You will leave her alone," he said. "That is not a request." And that was how it had started, though of course it had not started there at all. It had started 6 months earlier, in the dust of a late August afternoon, when a woman arrived at the edge of Redemption Valley on foot, carrying everything she owned in a canvas bag worn thin at the straps, and Monroe Hale had been the first person to lay eyes on her. He almost rode past her. The truth of it embarrassed him later, that he had almost just touched the brim of his hat and kept moving. He was returning from a 3-day job moving cattle along the eastern ridge, tired to his bones, sunburned, and thinking about nothing more complicated than a bath and a bed. The woman was walking along the road that curved down from the northern pass, and at first he thought she was a settler's wife who had lost her horse. Then he noticed she was not looking at him at all. Most people on that road, alone without a horse, would have looked up at the sound of approaching hoofbeats. They would have flagged the rider down or at least tracked the sound with their eyes, wary or hopeful. This woman kept walking, her gaze fixed on the valley spread below, and the quality of that gaze, the way it was taking in the land with a kind of quiet, hungry attention, made him slow his horse without deciding to. "Ma'am," he said. She looked up then. Her face was sun-darkened and lean, not pretty in the soft way men usually meant when they called women pretty, but striking, the kind of face that made you look twice and then a third time trying to understand why you could not look away. Her eyes were a clear, pale gray that caught the late afternoon light in a way that made Monroe think of winter sky just before snow. She was perhaps 24, 25, young but not soft. There was a quality about her like tempered steel, something that had been under pressure long enough to become stronger than it started. "I did not ask for anything," she said. "No," he agreed. "You did not. I stopped anyway." A pause. She seemed to weigh him, taking in the badge he did not wear but the bearing he carried regardless, the careful way his hand stayed visible, the fact that he had pulled up a respectful distance away and had not moved closer. "How far to the nearest town?" she asked. 4 miles, give or take. Redemption Valley, you walking the whole way." "That was my intention." Monroe looked at the canvas bag, at the quality of her boots, which were good boots but had been walked almost through their soles. He looked at the sky, where the sun was low and the temperature was already dropping in the way it did in the high country come late August. "I have got a horse," he said. "I noticed. She can carry double without complaint." "I am sure she can." The woman looked at him with those winter sky eyes. "Why?" The question was so direct it almost made him smile. "Why what? Why offer?" "You do not know me." "No," he said, "I do not." He paused. "My name is Monroe Hale. I work this valley and the land around it. I am not going to cause you trouble." Something shifted in her expression, not trust exactly, but a kind of careful consideration of the possibility of trust. It was a look he would come to know well. "Birdie Hayes," she said finally. "Pleased to make your acquaintance, Miss Hayes." Another pause. Then she picked up her bag. He dismounted, took the bag from her before she could protest, tied it to the saddle, and offered her a hand up. She took it with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a woman who had learned not to waste energy on the pretense of not needing help when she actually needed help. They rode the 4 miles to Redemption Valley in mostly silence, and Monroe was fine with that. He had never been a man who filled silence with noise for the sake of it. But he noticed things, the way she sat straight in the saddle without gripping too hard, the way her breathing was carefully controlled like she was holding something tightly inside herself, the way she scanned the valley below with that same hungry attention she had turned on it from the road, as if she was already mapping it, already deciding something. Redemption Valley was a prosperous little settlement by 1878 standards. It sat in a broad, well-watered valley in northern Colorado, sheltered by red sandstone ridges to the west and pine-covered slopes to the east. The main street had a proper hotel, a general store run by the Hennessy family, a doctor's office that was also the barber shop, a church that doubled as the school 3 days a week, and the Copper Penny Saloon, which was the real center of civic life whether the Reverend liked it or not. There was a mill at the northern end of town, and a small but productive cattle trade that kept money moving through local hands. Elder Caleb Drummond had arrived in the valley 2 years before Monroe, which meant he had arrived 11 years ago and had spent every one of those years carefully accumulating influence. He had a gift for it. He was not the official law, that was Marshall Prentice Webb, a decent man with a taste for bourbon and an aversion to confrontation, but Drummond had made himself indispensable in the ways that actually mattered. He had organized the first town council. He had facilitated land grants. He had introduced settlers to the lawyers and bankers in Denver who held the purse strings on homestead credit. He presented himself as the father of the valley, and the valley had mostly let him play that role without examining the cost too closely. Monroe had never trusted him. He could not have said why exactly in those first years. Drummond was outwardly civil, even generous. He had helped Monroe secure the lease on the 12-acre horse operation he ran on the eastern slope. But there was something in the way Drummond's eyes tracked a room, something calculating beneath the benevolent surface, that had always made Monroe keep his own counsel around the man. He did not think about any of that on the evening he rode Birdie Hayes into town. He was thinking about finding her a room at the hotel and getting himself some supper. He helped her down in front of the hotel, retrieved her bag, and was about to hand it over when she said very quietly, "Is there work here?" "What kind of work?" "Any kind." She said it without embarrassment, which he respected. "I can cook, clean, sew, handle horses, keep accounts. I learn quickly." He thought for a moment. "Mrs. Hennessy at the general store has been looking for someone to help with inventory and the books. Her husband's eyesight is going." Birdie's eyes sharpened. "Where is the store?" he pointed. She nodded, took her bag, and walked in that direction without another word. Monroe watched her go and felt something he could not immediately name, something that sat in his chest like a splinter, not painful, not yet, but present. Impossible to ignore. He told himself it was just the particular way she carried herself, the combination of fragility and iron that was unusual enough to be interesting. He told himself it would pass. It did not pass. He saw her again 3 days later at the general store, where she was already behind the counter helping Mrs. Hennessy organize a shipment of dry goods with an efficiency that had clearly impressed the older woman. Monroe came in for a sack of oats and a box of percussion caps, and when Birdie looked up and recognized him, something crossed her face that was almost a smile but not quite, a slight softening at the corners of her mouth, a slight warming in those gray eyes. "Mr. Hale," she said. "Miss Hayes, you found the store." "I did, Mrs. Hennessy," who was a warm-hearted woman with the social instincts of a golden retriever, looked back and forth between them with immediate and obvious interest. "You two know each other." "He gave me a ride into town," Birdie said. "Did he?" Mrs. Hennessy's smile widened considerably. "Monroe Hale, you never told me you were the charitable type." "I have got depths, Mrs. Hennessy," Monroe said, and paid for his goods and left before the conversation could develop further. But he came back. He found reasons. The oats needed replenishing more frequently than was strictly necessary. He developed a sudden interest in various notions and sundries. He was aware, with the clear-eyed self-knowledge of a man who had survived by reading situations accurately, that he was manufacturing excuses to be in a room where Birdie Hayes was, and he was also aware that she had noticed this and had not sent him away. They talked in the careful, oblique way of two people who were both instinctively private, but found themselves drawn toward honesty with each other in spite of it. He learned things about her in pieces, never in one long explanation but in small fragments offered and then pulled back, the way you might test ice before trusting your full weight to it. She had come from Missouri. She did not say more about that, and the way she did not say more about it told him there was something there that carried weight. She had worked as a seamstress, then as a cook in a boarding house, then had spent 2 years on a cattle drive in Kansas under a female cattlewoman named Amos who was apparently a legend in certain circles and a completely unknown quantity to everyone else. She could track weather by the feel of the air. She could read and write better than most men Monroe had met with formal educations. She was saving money. She was looking for something specific and she had not found it yet, and she would not say what it was. He did not press. He recognized the pattern because he had lived it himself. There were things in his own past that he kept behind a closed door, not out of shame exactly, but out of a private understanding that some histories were yours to hold and not to explain. His own history included 3 years as a hired gun in Texas, work he was not proud of but had done for reasons that made sense at the time, poverty and desperation having a way of clarifying a young man's choices. He had been good at it, frighteningly good, and that skill had been both his curse and his salvation. It had brought him north to Colorado, where he had used the money to lease land and start working horses and slowly, methodically, build a life that belonged to him rather than to whoever was hiring. He was 28 years old, and he had been alone for most of those years by design rather than accident. He had looked at the women in Redemption Valley with a kind of distant appreciation, the way you might admire a painting you could not afford, and had kept moving. He had told himself he was content with this arrangement. Birdie Hayes made him a liar. It happened gradually and then suddenly, the way most important things do. There was no single moment he could point to later and say, that was when everything changed. There was instead an accumulation of moments, each one small, each one adding weight until the whole structure of his careful solitude became impossible to maintain. There was the afternoon in October when a late autumn storm came down from the mountains faster than anyone expected, and Birdie was caught on the edge of town without a coat, because she had lent hers to a settler's child who had none, and Monroe found her soaked through and shaking and wrapped her in his own coat without a word. And the look she gave him when he did it, direct and unguarded and just for an instant completely undefended, went through him like a struck chord. There was the evening she stayed late at the store working on the accounts, and he happened to be walking past and saw the lamplight through the window and knocked, and she let him in, and they sat across the table from each other while she worked, and he ostensibly cleaned his pistol but mostly watched her work, and the silence between them was the most comfortable thing he had experienced in years. There was the Sunday in November when the Reverend's sermon went long, and Birdie, who attended church with the polite regularity of someone who had not quite decided what she believed but respected the community function of the thing, met Monroe's eyes from across the aisle at a moment when the Reverend said something particularly improbable, and they both looked away at exactly the same moment, and the suppressed amusement on her face matched exactly what he felt, and he thought. With a certainty that surprised him, she sees things the way I see them. That was the one that undid him, that small moment of perfect alignment. He asked her to have supper with him at the hotel dining room in December, framing it formally because he had the sense that Birdie responded better to directness than to the circuitous social maneuvering that some men thought was charming. "I would like to take you to supper," he said, standing in the store on a quiet Tuesday morning. Not as a courtesy, as something more than a courtesy. She set down the inventory she was cataloging and looked at him with those gray eyes that never let him get away with anything. "Are you being clear with me, Mr. Hale?" "Trying to be." "Then I will be clear in return. I am not looking for rescue. I'm not looking for someone to take care of me or tell me what to do. I am building something here, and if a man is not able to stand beside what I am building rather than in front of it, then supper is a poor idea." "I have never wanted to stand in front of anything," he said. "That is not my nature." A long pause. "I know that," she said, and the way she said it, like she had been watching him long enough to be certain, made his chest ache pleasantly. "Supper is a fine idea." What he did not know then, what he would not discover until February, was that Birdie had a plan. She had always had a plan. She had arrived in Redemption Valley with nothing, as everyone could plainly see, but nothing was not the same as nowhere to go. She had been saving money since before she arrived, sending small amounts ahead through a lawyer in Denver who had helped her identify a piece of land in the valley that was technically for sale under the terms of an old failed homestead claim. The piece of land was 40 acres on the south-facing slope above the valley floor, sheltered from the worst winter winds, with a spring-fed creek running through it, and soil dark enough to tell anyone who knew land that it had potential. The previous homesteader had filed on it in 1873, built a small cabin, and then been killed in a creek flooding before the 5-year requirement for proving up the claim was met. His widow had gone back east. The land had sat in a kind of legal limbo since then. Birdie had found it in the records through the Denver lawyer. She had verified the legal status. She had been systematically saving toward the filing fees and the cost of improving the cabin enough to live in it while she established the claim. She had been working at the Hennessy store for 5 months when she had saved enough, and in February of 1879, she walked into the land office in Redemption Valley and filed. Monroe found out 2 days later when she told him over supper, and the feeling he had when she laid out the whole plan, calm and detailed and thorough, was something he had to work to contain on his face because it was too large and too sudden. Admiration mixed with pride, mixed with a desperate, almost frightening tenderness. This woman had arrived in his valley with nothing but intention and intelligence, and had quietly, methodically built a foundation while everyone around her thought she was simply getting by. "You never said a word," he managed. "It was not anyone else's business until it was done," she said simply. "That land is good land," he said, because he knew the area well. "That south slope with the creek, that is good land." She smiled then fully, for what he realized was the first time he had seen her smile without reservation, and it remade her face entirely. He was lost, completely and helplessly lost, and he sat there across from her in the hotel dining room in February with the candles on the table and the snow coming down outside, and understood, with the clean certainty of a man who has never lied well to himself, that he was in love with Birdie Hayes. He had not told her. He was going to wait. He was going to give her time to establish what she was building without his feelings complicating the architecture of it. He had a patient nature when patience was required, and he understood that Birdie's independence was not a wall against him but the foundation of who she was, and that the worst thing he could do was push his way into it before she had invited him. So he was careful. He helped when she asked, and she did ask sometimes, practical things: his opinion on the cabin repairs, his knowledge of the land, his connections with the supply merchants. He helped without making it feel like help, which meant he helped on her terms when she wanted it, in the ways she specified, and then stepped back. He watched her transform the 40 acres from a legal abstraction into something real, watched her begin clearing brush from around the cabin, watched her start planting the garden beds and the fence line. He fell in love with her more every week, which he had not thought was possible since he had already been as certain of it as he had ever been of anything. And then, in March, Elder Caleb Drummond noticed. Drummond had not paid particular attention to Birdie during the months she worked at the store. She was a hired woman, unremarkable in his calculus of people who mattered and people who did not. But when she filed on the South Slope land, she became suddenly relevant, because Drummond had been quietly positioning to acquire that same land himself. He had done it the way he did everything, through layers of distance and deniability. He had a man in Denver, a land speculator named Fowler, who had been monitoring the untitled parcels in the valley. The South Slope 40 was one of several Drummond intended to eventually consolidate under a grazing lease he had been planning for 2 years, a large-scale cattle operation that would require significant acreage, and that would, if it succeeded, make him the most economically powerful man in the region, beyond even his current influence. Birdie's filing had cut directly across this plan. Drummond was too experienced and too careful to show his anger immediately. He made discreet inquiries. He sent a letter to Fowler in Denver. He examined what legal mechanisms might be available to him. And when he had assembled his options, he came to Monroe. Monroe was shoeing a horse in his paddock on a cold March afternoon when Drummond appeared at the gate in his clean suit and his walking cane, looking entirely out of place. "Mr. Hale," Drummond said pleasantly. Monroe kept his attention on the horse's hoof. "Elder Drummond, I wanted to discuss a matter with you concerning the Hayes woman." Monroe set the hoof down and straightened and looked at Drummond with an expression that did not invite further pleasantries. "What about her?" "I have been looking into her background." Drummond paused, letting that land. "There are some questions about her history, her origins, whether the name Hayes is her legal name or an assumed one, whether she has any other financial obligations or legal entanglements that might complicate a property claim." "You have been looking into her background," Monroe repeated, very flat. "The Valley has an interest in ensuring that land filings are legitimate," Drummond said smoothly. "As a member of the town council, it is my responsibility to—" "Elder Drummond." Monroe picked up his tools and walked toward the fence until he was close enough that Drummond had to look up at him slightly. "Whatever you are building toward, I would appreciate you being direct about it." A brief pause. Drummond's amiable mask slipped just slightly, showing something colder beneath. "She is an unknown quantity, Monroe. She arrived here with nothing, no family, no references, no verifiable history. That 40 acres is valuable land." "It is." Monroe watched him. "And she filed on it legally. There may be challenges to the filing, irregularities." Drummond let the implication sit in the air. "If you were to counsel her to quietly withdraw the claim, there would be fair compensation, enough for her to start fresh somewhere more suitable." Monroe was quiet for a long time, long enough that the wind moved through the pine trees on the slope above and a hawk turned a slow circle against the high pale sky. Then he said very quietly, "I want you to hear me clearly. Do not go near her with this. Do not threaten her. Do not manufacture challenges to her filing. If you do, I will take it to Marshal Webb, and then I will take it to Denver, and then I will take it to every lawyer between here and the territorial capital." Drummond's expression closed completely. "You are making an enemy, boy." "I have had enemies before," Monroe said. "Good afternoon." He waited until Drummond had walked his careful way back to the road before he let himself feel the weight of what had just happened. Drummond was not a man who made empty threats. He was a man who built traps slowly and patiently and sprung them at the moment of maximum disadvantage. Monroe had made himself visible as Birdie's defender, which was a choice with consequences, but it was not a choice he could have made differently. He went to Birdie that evening. She was at the cabin, working by lamplight on the window frames, which had rotted through and needed replacing. She looked up when she heard his horse and set down her tools with a patience that suggested she had expected him. "Something happened," she said. "Yes." He dismounted, tied the horse, came and stood near her in the doorway of the cabin with the cold evening air moving around them. "Drummond came to see me today. He wants your land." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know." He stared at her. "You know." "I suspected, from before I filed." She turned back to the window frame, not dismissively but thoughtfully, her hands moving over the wood. The land records in Denver were not as straightforward as they should have been. Someone had been in those files recently, flagging that parcel. I thought it might be a speculator or it might be Drummond. Either way, I filed as quickly as I could and made sure everything was in perfect legal order. Monroe sat down on the cabin step and looked at her with a feeling that was half disbelief and half something that would take him a moment to identify as awe. "You walked into his ambush on purpose." "I walked into it prepared," she corrected, "which is different." "Birdie." She looked at him. "He is dangerous," Monroe said. "Not in the way that makes itself obvious. The quiet kind. He has got 20 years of influence in this valley and he knows how to use it." "I know." Her voice was steady. "What did he say to you specifically?" He told her. She listened without interrupting, her gray eyes tracking something he could not see, processing and cataloging. When he finished, she was quiet again for a moment. "He will not use legal means first," she said. "He will try social means. He will try to undermine my reputation, make me seem unreliable, unsuitable. Then if that does not work, he will manufacture a legal challenge. That is my read too. Then we should move quickly on the cabin repairs so I can demonstrate established occupation. And I need to talk to Mr. Hennessy about writing me a formal letter of character. And I should write to that lawyer in Denver before Drummond does." Monroe looked at her for a long time in the lamplight. This woman who had arrived with nothing and already understood the shape of the fight she was in before anyone had told her it was a fight. He wanted to say something. Something real, something that communicated the particular feeling in his chest that had been building since October and was now simply too large to be ignored. But the moment had a specific gravity to it, practical and urgent, and he held his peace and helped her measure the window frame instead. April came in hard and dry that year, the kind of spring that made old-timers nervous about summer. Monroe worked his horses, ran the eastern slope, and spent every spare hour he had either at Birdie's cabin helping with improvements or at her side, navigating the social landscape of Redemption Valley with a watchful attention. Drummond had, as Birdie predicted, begun the social campaign. The means were subtle, the kind of thing you might not notice from close up but which Monroe recognized because he had learned to watch the pattern rather than the individual instances. A word here and there, dropped into conversations at the Copper Penny or after church, vague but persistent. Questions about Birdie's origins. References to women who arrived alone in frontier towns with unnamed pasts. Nothing specific enough to confront directly but damaging in aggregate. The valley was not uniformly hostile. Mrs. Hennessy was firmly and vocally in Birdie's corner, which carried weight because the Hennessy store was the economic heart of most families' daily lives. Marshall Prentice Webb was officially neutral but personally sympathetic, and Monroe had made sure to keep him informed of Drummond's maneuvers. The Reverend liked Birdie and said so from the pulpit, which Drummond had clearly not anticipated. But there were others who were more susceptible to Drummond's influence, particularly the ranchers and cattlemen whose operations were tied to Drummond's goodwill and credit. Monroe felt the shift in how some of these men looked at him, the slightly narrowed calculation in their eyes, and understood that he was paying a social price for his association with Birdie. He found he did not mind. He had not expected to mind so little, but when he examined the feeling, it was perfectly clear. Whatever it cost him was worth it. He told her one evening in April. They were sitting on the cabin steps after a long day of fence work, the valley spread below them catching the last gold of the sunset, and the silence between them had that particular quality it sometimes had, full rather than empty, both of them resting in it comfortably. He had a cup of coffee and she had the same, and he was watching the way the light changed on the ridge to the west when he said, without preamble, "I love you." She did not look startled. She turned and looked at him with those clear gray eyes, and there was something in her expression that suggested she had been expecting this, or something like it, and had been having her own private conversation with herself about what she thought and felt. "Monroe," she said, "you do not have to say anything back." "I know I do not." She set her coffee down on the step. I just want to be certain I am saying the right thing." A pause. "I am not an easy person to love. I am aware." "I have a dark past," she said, and it was the first time she had used those words, and the weight of them was significant. "There are things in my history that I have not told you. You can tell me or not, that is your business." She looked at him for a long time. Then she turned back to the valley and was quiet, and he waited, and the waiting felt right. "I left Missouri because I had to," she said finally. "I had a husband." Monroe was still. "He is dead," she said, and her voice was very flat and very controlled, the way voices got when they had been forced to be flat and controlled so many times about a particular subject that the flatness itself had become a kind of armor. "He died 5 years ago. The marriage was not. It was not what anyone would have chosen freely. I was 17 when my father arranged it. By the time my husband died, I had been surviving it for 3 years." The words "arranged it" and "surviving it" did the work of a much longer explanation, and Monroe understood them. "When he died, his family blamed me," she continued. "There was nothing legal done because there was nothing for law to find, but they made my life impossible. I left. I have been moving since, building enough to stand on." She paused. "Birdie Hayes is my mother's name. My birth name is something I left in Missouri, and I would prefer to keep it there." Monroe nodded once. "All right," she looked at him. "That is your response, all right. What else would I say? You were a girl in an impossible situation. You survived it and you kept going. That is not a dark past. That is just a person." He met her eyes. "It does not change a single thing I said." Something happened in her face then. Something careful and long-maintained cracked slightly, not breaking, nothing so dramatic but a hairline fracture in the controlled surface, and what showed through was something raw and young and terribly human. She looked away quickly, but not before he saw it. "I love you," she said to the valley quietly. "I have been trying not to, because I could not afford to depend on anyone, and love is a form of depending. But I do." He reached over and took her hand where it rested on the step, and she let him, and they sat like that as the sunset finished and the first stars appeared above the eastern ridge, and it was the most Monroe had felt at peace in as long as he could remember. But Drummond had not given up. In May, his legal strategy became clear. He had found a technicality, or rather, his man Fowler in Denver had manufactured one. The original homestead filing from 1873 had a clerical error in the legal description of the land boundaries, a transposed number that placed the eastern edge of the property in a slightly different location than the physical markers on the ground. Under the interpretation Fowler was advancing, this meant the original claim had been invalid from the beginning, which in turn meant Birdie's filing, which was based on the abandoned original claim, was also invalid, and the land was in fact open for a new primary filing. Drummond filed that new primary filing in Denver on the 15th of May. Monroe found out from Marshall Webb, who had received a copy of the documents and brought them to Monroe's place early in the morning with the expression of a man delivering news he found personally offensive. "It is clever," Webb said, spreading the papers on Monroe's table. "The boundary error is real, small but real. Fowler has been talking to a judge in Denver, a Judge Alcott, who apparently has some history with Drummond." Monroe read the documents carefully. Then he rode to Birdie. She was already aware. The lawyer in Denver had sent her a telegraph that morning. She was sitting at the table in the cabin with the telegraph in her hands and the lamp burning even though it was fully daylight, and she had the look of someone who had been hit but was deciding how to feel about it before she let herself feel it. Monroe sat down across from her. "Tell me what your lawyer says." "He says the boundary error is real, but that challenging Drummond's new filing on the grounds of bad faith is possible. It would require evidence that Drummond knew about the error before I filed and deliberately withheld that information to his advantage. And it would require a fair hearing from a judge who is not in Drummond's pocket." She folded the telegraph precisely. "He says this could take a year, maybe 2. Monroe was quiet, turning this over. "What would happen to your claim in the meantime?" "It would be in dispute. I could continue to occupy and improve the land, but with no legal certainty. Drummond could petition to stop any improvements until the dispute is resolved." He looked at the cabin around them, at the work she had done, at the new window frames and the swept floor and the small evidence of a life being carefully built. He felt something in him go very cold and very focused. "I need to know something," he said. "The Denver lawyer, can he find the evidence, the bad faith?" "He thinks so. There are land records in Denver that might show Drummond or Fowler flagging the boundary error before my filing date. If they knew and said nothing, that is actionable." "How much time does he need?" 3 months, maybe 4. "Then we need to hold Drummond off for 3 months, Monroe said. "Keep him from successfully executing the petition to stop improvements. Give your lawyer time." Birdie looked at him. "Monroe, I have some credit with Judge Harmon in Colorado Springs," he said. "He is not in Drummond's pocket, and he has jurisdiction that overlaps with Alcott's. We can file our own injunction keeping Drummond's filing in dispute pending investigation of bad faith. We can buy the time." She was very still. "How do you know Judge Harmon?" "I did some work for him years back. He owes me a favor I have never called in." He paused. "I want to call it in now." Monroe, her voice was careful. "What kind of work?" He met her eyes because he had told her he valued honesty between them, and he meant it. "The kind I am not proud of, before I came here. When I was very young and very broke and not making good choices." A pause. "Harmon needed a situation managed quietly. I managed it. He is an honest man who made one dishonest choice and has been trying to balance the ledger since. He will help, and he will not ask me what I need it for." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said very quietly, "All right, call it in." He rode to Colorado Springs the following week, a hard 2-day ride each way, and he had a 2-hour conversation with Judge Harmon that he would not describe in detail to anyone. When he rode back to Redemption Valley, he brought with him a signed injunction that effectively froze Drummond's secondary filing, pending an independent review of the bad faith claim. It was the first time in decades, Monroe heard later, that someone had successfully challenged a Drummond initiative in this particular way. He could imagine what the elder's face had looked like when he received the news. June came, and with it the open confrontation in the Copper Penny Saloon that had been building since March. The moment Monroe had stood in the lamplight and told Elder Caleb Drummond in front of 20 witnesses that Birdie Hayes came to this valley with nothing and owed nobody a thing. It had not started there. It had started that morning, when Drummond, losing patience with his stalled legal strategy, and perhaps genuinely surprised that Monroe had managed the Harmon injunction, had gone to Birdie directly. He had appeared at the general store while she was working and had said, in front of Mrs. Hennessy and 2 customers, that Birdie's legal claim was fraudulent, that her identity was assumed, and that the land office had been petitioned to investigate her character. Mrs. Hennessy had ordered him out of the store. But the damage was done. The words had been said in front of witnesses, and by noon the whole town knew there was a public accusation on the table. By the time Monroe heard about it that evening and walked into the Copper Penny where Drummond was holding court with several of his supporters, Monroe was carrying 6 months of careful patience that had just run out, and the words he said were not the words of a man who was angry. They were the words of a man who had made a decision. "She came to this valley with nothing," he said, to Drummond and to every man in that room, "and she owed nobody a single thing." He said it again, louder, and the silence in the room was absolute. "Everything she has, she built," Monroe continued. "Every legal step she took correctly. And the claim that she is fraudulent comes from a man who was already trying to steal her land before she filed on it, and I have the documentation to prove it." Drummond stood up from his chair, and for just a moment his composure cracked and the real man showed underneath, harder and colder and more frightened than the benevolent elder face he wore. "You are making accusations you cannot support, Hale. The documentation is in Judge Harmon's office in Colorado Springs," Monroe said. "The land office in Denver has a copy. Marshal Webb has a copy." He looked at Drummond steadily. "You tried to take what belonged to her. You failed. And this valley deserves to know who you actually are." The silence held for another long beat. Then Marshal Webb, who had been sitting quietly in the corner and whom Monroe had not even noticed, stood up and cleared his throat. "I believe, Elder Drummond, you are going to want to speak with a lawyer," Webb said. "Given that the documentation Mr. Hale mentioned is accurate, and given that I have reviewed it myself, there are some questions about the conduct of the secondary filing that fall within my jurisdiction to pursue." Drummond looked at Webb, looked at Monroe, looked at the room full of men who were watching him with expressions that ranged from uncertain to openly appraising. He was too experienced to make a scene. He picked up his cane, straightened his jacket, and walked out without another word. The room exhaled. Monroe stayed for another hour, answering questions from men who had been on the fence and were now rebalancing their positions with the pragmatic flexibility of people who recognize a shift in the center of gravity when they see one. He drank one glass of whiskey, said what he needed to say, and then went to Birdie. She was at the cabin. She had heard everything from Mrs. Hennessy, who had apparently sent her son to relay the events of the saloon scene in real time. She was standing in the doorway when Monroe rode up, and the look on her face was complicated, that particular expression she sometimes wore that combined gratitude and fierceness in equal parts. "You could have consulted me," she said. "I know, I am sorry." He dismounted. "It happened fast. You said you have documentation proving bad faith." "We do. Your Denver lawyer found it last week. He sent copies. I had them distributed before I went to the saloon." He paused. "I should have told you that immediately. I found out this morning, and then I heard what Drummond did at the store, and He stopped. I was not thinking clearly." She looked at him for a moment. Then she stepped aside from the doorway. "Come inside," she said. "Tell me everything." He did. He laid out the full picture, the documentation the Denver lawyer had found, the timeline that proved Drummond and Fowler had known about the boundary error and flagged it deliberately in preparation for exactly this kind of challenge, and the legal path forward that now looked considerably more promising than it had a month ago. When he finished, Birdie was quiet for a long time, sitting across the table from him with her hands folded and her gray eyes moving across the middle distance. "He is not going to stop cleanly," she said. "He is going to make trouble for you now, personal trouble. I know, he might come for your lease on the eastern slope. He might." Monroe met her gaze. "That is a price I am willing to pay." "Monroe, Birdie," his voice was gentle but firm. "I told you I would stand beside what you are building, not in front of it. This is standing beside it. This is my choice, and I am making it clear-eyed." A pause. "You are going to win this. The documentation is solid. Webb is not in Drummond's pocket, and he is going to pursue the question of the secondary filing. Drummond is going to be exposed as the kind of man who manipulates land records to dispossess vulnerable people, and this valley is going to have to look at that and decide who it is." She looked at him for a long time. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over his, and the touch of it went through him like always. "I love you," she said. It came more easily than the first time, and that easiness was its own kind of statement. "I love you," he said back. July came hot and bright, and it brought the resolution that Birdie's Denver lawyer had predicted. The independent review of Drummond's secondary filing was completed by a pair of federal land commissioners who came down from Denver, men who had no local affiliations, and who examined the evidence with the rigorous impartiality that the situation deserved. Their finding was published at the end of the month. The original homestead boundary error had been documented in Fowler's private records more than 3 months before Birdie filed, and correspondence between Fowler and Drummond discussing the strategic value of withholding this information had been located. The secondary filing was voided. Birdie's claim was validated. The 40 acres on the south slope was hers. There was a further consequence, which was that the land commissioners forwarded their findings to the federal land office and to a United States attorney in Denver. And by August, Elder Caleb Drummond was facing a federal inquiry into his land practices, not only in Redemption Valley, but in 3 other counties where, it emerged, he had engaged in similar tactics against other small claimants who had had neither Monroe's connections nor Birdie's lawyer. He resigned from the town council before he could be removed and moved to Denver, where the inquiry would continue. Whether the ultimate consequences would be proportionate to the harm he had done was a question that law and time would answer, but he was gone from the valley. On the day the land decision was announced, Mrs. Hennessy organized a celebration that the whole town attended, which began as a modest supper and evolved into something that lasted until midnight. And Birdie stood in the middle of it all with the particular expression of a woman who has won something that cost her everything she had and is not entirely sure yet how to stand in the fact of it. Monroe watched her from across the room for most of the evening, feeling something that was too full and too warm to be contained in any word he knew. When the crowd thinned and the night had gone quiet, he found her standing outside on the main street looking up at the summer stars. He stood beside her. She did not look at him, but she leaned slightly toward him, just a fraction, and he understood the gesture. "What do you want?" he asked. "Now that you have the land, what comes next?" She was quiet for a moment. "A proper house," she said. "Not the cabin, a real house with a good kitchen and windows that face south. A garden, chickens, maybe a cow." A pause. "I have been thinking about growing hay. The south slope would be good for it. I could sell hay to the ranchers." "It would be good for it," he agreed. "The creek would let you irrigate the lower field." "Yes," she paused again. "I have been thinking about something else too." "Tell me." She turned and looked at him then, and in the starlight her face was very clear and completely undefended, all the armor down. "I have been thinking about not being alone anymore," she said. "I have been alone for a long time and I am very good at it, but I find I would like to practice something different." Monroe turned to face her fully. "Birdie Hayes," he said, "if I asked you to marry me, what would you say?" She held his gaze for a long moment. "I would say that I would need you to understand what that means with me, that I keep my own name, that my land is my land and my decisions about it are mine, that I am a partner and not a possession." "I know that," he said. "I have always known that. Those are not conditions, those are just who you are." Something in her face went soft in the way it only ever did for him. "Then I would say yes," she said. "If you asked, I am asking, then yes." He kissed her there in the middle of the main street of Redemption Valley, under the summer stars, with the sound of the celebration still drifting from the open windows of the hotel dining room. And it was the kind of kiss that had 6 months of careful restraint in it and felt, when it finally happened, like the most natural and inevitable thing in the world. They married in September of 1879, in the church that doubled as the school, with the Reverend presiding and every person in Redemption Valley who could fit inside standing witness. Mrs. Hennessy cried through the entire ceremony. Marshall Webb stood as Monroe's witness and managed to look simultaneously dignified and deeply moved. Birdie wore a dress she had made herself from fabric she had chosen with characteristic care, a deep green wool that did something extraordinary in the morning light, and her hair was down for the first time Monroe had ever seen it, a discovery that made him stare for a moment in the church doorway until she met his eyes and raised an eyebrow. The vows they wrote themselves were direct and unornamental, which was exactly right for both of them. They promised honesty and respect in partnership, and to stand beside each other's lives rather than inside them. The Reverend declared it the most practically worded wedding ceremony he had ever performed, which he meant as a compliment, and it was taken as one. After the celebration, they rode up the slope to the cabin together, the 40 acres stretching around them in the September evening, and Monroe looked at the land she had made hers and thought about what it would become. In October, he began framing the house. He had timber connections from his years running cattle along the mountain supply routes, and he had the kind of practical building knowledge that came from helping settlers construct things for over a decade. The house went up over the fall and winter in stages, a real house with a good kitchen, south-facing windows, a sitting room with a fireplace, 2 bedrooms, and a porch that faced the valley so you could watch the light change on the ridges in the evening. Birdie worked beside him when she could, and when she could not she was managing the planning for the hay operation, which she had designed with the same methodical thoroughness she applied to everything, consulting the agricultural publications she ordered from Denver, talking to the farmers in the next valley over who had been doing hay for 5 years, calculating the seed costs against the market price and the creek's irrigation capacity. They fell into the rhythms of a shared life with a naturalness that surprised Monroe, who had been alone long enough that he had expected the adjustment to be harder. But Birdie was not a person who created friction unnecessarily, and he had never been one either, and the domestic geography they negotiated was honest and largely effortless. She told him more of Missouri over the winter, not in a single telling but in pieces, the way she had always given him things, slowly and carefully and on her own timeline. He listened without judgment and without pity, both of which she would have found offensive, but with the kind of quiet, steady attention that said, "I am here, this happened to you, you are safe now." The picture that emerged was of a girl who had been sold into a marriage at 17 to a man who was 32 and cruel in ways that were difficult to name, because they left no marks on the outside. She had survived 3 years of it. She had built her interior life into something indestructible, because the exterior life was not hers to control. When her husband died in a riding accident, she had grieved the absence of grief and the presence of relief in equal measure, and the guilt of that relief had haunted her for years. Monroe told her it should not haunt her. He told her relief in those circumstances was as honest a feeling as any and significantly more understandable than guilt. She argued with him about it in the thoughtful, careful way she argued about everything, and by the end she had not entirely agreed but had clearly found the debate useful. He told her about Texas in return, about the 3 years that he preferred to keep behind a closed door, about the things he had done for money during a period when he had believed that a man without money had no choices, and that choices were the only thing a man could really be said to own. About the moment he had stopped, which had not been a dramatic moment but a quiet one, a morning in a dusty Texas town when he had looked at himself in a store window and not recognized the person he saw. She listened with the same quality of attention he gave her. When he finished, she said, "You left it behind. I did my best. That is all anyone can do with who they were." She paused. "You are a good man, Monroe. I am trying to be." "You have been," she said simply, and the way she said it, as a statement of observed fact rather than a comfort or a compliment, was the thing he needed most. The hay field was planted in the spring of 1880 and produced its first harvest that summer, modest but promising. By autumn, Birdie was selling hay to 3 local ranchers and had established accounts with 2 more. Monroe's horse operation had expanded to include a stallion he had brought up from New Mexico, a beautiful gray with good bloodlines, and the mares he was breeding to him were producing foals that were attracting attention from ranchers throughout the county. They were building something together on that south slope, the house and the hay and the horses and the life, And the something was real in the way that only things you build yourself, with your own hands and your own choices, ever are. In late summer of 1880, Birdie told Monroe she was pregnant. He was in the paddock with the gray stallion when she came out to find him, and the look on her face, which was carefully controlled and also could not entirely contain something enormous behind it, made him go very still. "Tell me," he said. She told him. He crossed the paddock in 4 strides and held her, and she let him, her face pressed against his chest and her arms around his back, and he could feel her breathing very carefully, processing the size of what was happening. "Are you frightened?" He asked into her hair, a long pause. "Yes," she admitted. "I did not expect to be, but yes." "I am too," he said honestly, "but I think that is the right response to something this important." She laughed, a small, slightly shaky sound. "Yes, I suppose it is." He held her for a long time in the August heat with the horses quiet in the paddock and the valley spread below them and the house they had built visible from where they stood. "Whatever happens," he said, "we will meet it together." "I know," she said. "That is the part I am sure of." The winter of 1880 was harder than the year before, the kind of Colorado winter that tested everything, the structures you had built and the character of the people inside them. Birdie was well into her pregnancy by December, large and uncomfortable but characteristically undeterred, still managing the accounts and the correspondence for the hay operation from the house while Monroe handled the physical work outside. There were difficult nights and difficult days. There were conversations about fear that they might not have had otherwise. There were moments of a particular intimacy that only comes from being sealed inside a cold winter together with nowhere to go but toward each other. Monroe learned things about Birdie he might not have learned in easier circumstances. That she was afraid of being helpless, more than she was afraid of anything else, and that the physical constraints of pregnancy touched that fear in specific ways that required patience and honesty from both of them to navigate. That underneath her controlled surface, she had a humor that was dry and unexpected, and appeared at the moments you least anticipated it. That she could not sleep without knowing the doors were bolted, which was a habit from Missouri that had never left her body even when her mind knew it was unnecessary. She learned things about him too, that he had nightmares sometimes, quiet ones that he woke from quickly and without disturbance, but that she noticed anyway. That he was gentler than his appearance suggested, with animals and with people, a quality that was not soft but was deeply considered. That he was afraid of losing people he loved, a fear with its own history that he talked about one winter night by the fire, the specific losses of his early life that had made him careful about attachment for so long. They moved toward each other in the winter darkness, and what they built was not just a partnership, but a genuine intimacy of 2 people who had both been alone a long time and had found in each other something they had not known they were missing. The baby came in March of 1881, attended by the valley's doctor, a competent Scotsman named Macpherson, who had delivered more than 100 frontier babies, and who treated the whole event with the brisk assurance of a man for whom childbirth was a serious but manageable business. The baby was a boy. He arrived in the small hours of a cold March morning into a world that was slowly beginning to warm, and Monroe held him for the first time wrapped in the flannel Birdie had prepared with the same methodical care she applied to everything. And the feeling of holding this small new person was unlike anything he had ever experienced, something that reorganized everything inside him in a way he had not anticipated and could not have been prepared for. Birdie, exhausted and clear-eyed in the way she was clear-eyed about everything, watched Monroe hold the baby, and her expression was the most unguarded he had ever seen it, open all the way down to something fundamental and soft and entirely without defense. "He looks like you," she said. Monroe looked at the baby's scrunched, red, furious little face. "I hope not. He seems very unhappy about everything." She laughed, tired and genuine. "You also seem very unhappy about everything from the outside. On the inside you are quite different. Is that a compliment? "It is an observation," she said, smiling. They named him Samuel after Monroe's father, who had been a hard man with one genuine quality, a refusal to lie, which Monroe thought was worth honoring. Samuel James Hale, registered at the land office and the church both, with Birdie's name on the registration as Birdie Hayes Hale, which she had chosen, keeping both names, and which Monroe thought was exactly right. Samuel was a serious, watchful baby who grew into a serious, watchful toddler with his father's dark eyes and his mother's particular quality of stillness. He was walking before he was a year old and talking in full sentences shortly after, and Birdie's delight in his developing intelligence was one of the most beautiful things Monroe had ever watched. The hay operation had grown by 1882 to cover nearly half the 40 acres, with a second field they had broken and planted on the lower stretch near the creek. Monroe's horse breeding operation had become the most respected in the county, with buyers coming from as far as Denver to look at the foals coming off the gray stallion. They had hired 2 hands to help with the work, a pair of brothers from a Mexican family that had been homesteading in the next valley, Ernesto and Diego Salazar, who were skilled and reliable, and who became, over the years, something closer to family than to employees. The valley itself had changed. Drummond's departure had created a vacuum that the town had filled with something more democratic and more contentious than his smooth management, but also more honest. The town council had been reconstituted with elected members rather than the self-selected arrangement Drummond had maintained, and while the politics were messier, the outcomes were more broadly representative. Marshall Webb had retired in 1881 and been replaced by a younger man named Aldridge, who was less experienced but considerably more energetic about the actual work of enforcement. Birdie had become, somewhat against her own wishes, a figure of informal authority in the valley. She had not sought this and was occasionally annoyed by it, but the combination of her demonstrated intelligence, her record of legal and economic success, and the story of how she had confronted Drummond's scheme had given her a credibility that the valley respected. Women in particular sought her out, both for practical advice and for something harder to name, the example of a woman who had built something on her own terms. She was careful about this. She was honest that she had not done it entirely alone, that Monroe had stood beside her when it mattered, that Mrs. Hennessy had supported her, that her Denver lawyer had done essential work. She refused to be made into a myth when she was a person, which made people respect her more, not less. Monroe watched all of this with a pride that was quiet and deep, the kind of pride that does not need to announce itself because it is simply a permanent feature of how you see someone. In 1883, Birdie was pregnant again. This time she was less frightened, more experienced, and characteristically better prepared. She had read everything the Denver medical publications had to offer on the subject and had had 3 conversations with Dr. Macpherson before the first trimester was finished. Monroe was also less frightened, though not entirely unafraid. He had learned that fear of loss, when you loved people this much, was simply the permanent texture of caring, not something to be resolved but something to be lived with. This baby came in November, a girl this time, born in the house they had built together on the south slope on an afternoon when the aspens outside the window were bare, and the sky was the particular clear blue of a high-country autumn. She was calm from the first moment, looking around with dark eyes that were wide and curious, and Birdie looked at her and said, very quietly, "Hello." They named her Clara, after nobody in particular, because they liked the name, and because some names did not need to carry anyone else's history. Samuel was 2.5 and received his sister with the gravity of a small person who has been carefully prepared for an important event and is taking his responsibilities seriously. He sat beside Birdie in the large bed and looked at the baby with an expression that was 3/4 scientific and 1/4 something much more tender and said, "She is very small." "You were also very small," Monroe told him. "Was I?" Samuel considered this. "I do not remember." "No one does," Birdie said. "That is why we have people who remember for us." It was a beautiful fall that year, and the winter that followed was hard but not cruel, and they went through it together in the house on the south slope with the two babies and the accounts and the work and the long evenings by the fire. And what Monroe felt during those evenings, watching Birdie read while Clara slept on her lap and Samuel sat on the floor with the wooden horse Monroe had carved for him, was something he recognized as happiness, actual happiness. The kind that does not announce itself dramatically, but is simply present, dependably and deeply present every day. By 1885, the operation on the South Slope had grown substantially. They had added a proper barn and a second outbuilding for storing the hay harvest. Monroe had bought a piece of adjacent land to the east, adding another 20 acres that extended the horse pasture significantly. The Salazar brothers had each started families of their own in the valley, and the informal community that had grown up around the Hale operation was a small, functional world of its own. Samuel was 4, and had discovered that horses were his primary interest in life, which delighted Monroe entirely. He had inherited his mother's analytical mind and his father's patience with animals, and he spent entire afternoons at the fence of the horse pasture watching the mares and foals with an attention that Monroe recognized as genuine understanding rather than childish fascination. Clara was learning to walk, and then to run with the determined speed of a child who has decided that standing still is an unsatisfactory approach to existence. She was different from Samuel in every observable way, louder and more impulsive and profoundly social, conducting long conversations with anyone who would hold still long enough, including the chickens, which she found endlessly interesting. Birdie watched her children with a love that was enormous and slightly helpless in its enormity, the way love for children sometimes is, too large to be entirely comfortable, overflowing the containers you thought you had prepared for it. Monroe had noticed this about her. The way the love she had for her children seemed to surprise her regularly with its dimensions, as if she kept discovering it was larger than she had measured. He felt it too. He had not known, before Samuel was born, how completely a child could reorganize the interior of a person. He had thought he understood what mattered to him. He had been wrong about the depth of it. In the summer of 1886, Monroe found a letter that had followed him from Texas, moving through several forwarding addresses before finally catching up to him through the land office in Denver. It was from a woman named Margaret Hale, his mother's sister, whom he had not seen since he was 16. She had found out he was in Colorado through means he could not entirely trace, and she wrote to tell him that his mother had died in 1880, which he had not known because he had not been in contact, and to ask if he wanted any of his mother's things. He sat with the letter for a day before he told Birdie. Then he told her everything about his family, the parts he had left behind in the same way she had left parts of herself in Missouri. His father's death when he was 14. His mother's remarriage to a man who had no particular interest in Monroe's presence. The gradual dissolution of whatever connection to home might have held him, which had sent him south to Texas at 16 with nothing but youth and the particular recklessness of a boy who has run out of reasons to stay anywhere. Birdie listened the way she always listened, completely and without interruption. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you want to go to Texas?" "I do not think so," he said. "What would I go back to? My mother is gone. The people I knew are not the people who are mine. These are," she said simply, meaning herself and the children and the valley and the life. "Write back to your mother's sister. It might matter to her to know you are well." He did. He wrote to Margaret Hale and told her he was in Colorado, that he was married and had 2 children, that he was well. Margaret wrote back with a warmth that surprised him, and they began a correspondence that continued for years, a thread of family connection that cost little and returned something he had not realized he was missing. Clara started walking all the way across the south field to the Salazar household that same summer, a trip she undertook with the independence of a 2-year-old, who does not understand that small children are not supposed to navigate large properties alone. The Salazar family received her with the cheerful acceptance of people who found her company more entertaining than alarming, and Ernesto's wife, Rosa, became a kind of honorary aunt who taught Clara things in Spanish that Clara then repeated to Monroe and Birdie with great pride. The valley continued to grow and change. New families arrived with each year, settling the remaining parcels above and below the valley floor. A proper school was built in 1885 that was only a school and no longer needed to double as the church. The general store expanded, and the Hennessy family's operation grew with it. A small bank opened in 1884, backed by Denver capital but locally managed by a young man named Garrett who was competent and honest, both of which mattered considerably. Monroe and Birdie's operation was by 1887 among the most substantial in the county. The horse breeding had developed a reputation that brought buyers from Denver regularly and occasional inquiries from as far as Wyoming. The hay operation was steady and productive. They had a cook now, and a housekeeper who came 3 days a week, practical expansions that Birdie had agreed to with the clear-eyed acknowledgement that she had more to do than she could do alone, and that accepting help was not defeat. Samuel was 6 and attending the school 3 days a week, which he found largely insufficient because the other subjects were not horses. Monroe was teaching him to ride properly on a small, steady mare named Dove who had the temperament of a schoolteacher, patient and consistent. Watching his son on horseback was one of the great pleasures of Monroe's daily life. Clara was 3 and had opinions about everything, including the horses, the garden, the chickens, the arrangement of things on tables, and the proper way to tell a story, which according to Clara involved significant dramatic emphasis and occasional sound effects. She had her mother's gray eyes and her father's dark hair and the personality of someone entirely her own, which was the most interesting person Monroe thought he had ever met. On a September evening in 1887, Monroe and Birdie were sitting on the porch they had built to face the valley, watching the light do its evening work on the western ridges. The children were in bed. The valley below was quiet, a few lights in the windows of the town, the creek audible if you listened for it, the horses moving softly in the pasture. Birdie had a cup of coffee and Monroe had one too, and the silence between them was the most comfortable silence he knew, which was saying something because he had known a lot of silences. "Do you remember the road from the northern pass?" she said. He knew what she meant. "Yes." "I was so frightened," she said. "I did not show it. I was very practiced at not showing it. But I was walking down that road and I did not know what was at the bottom, and I had $17 in a bag with 3 changes of clothes, and I was genuinely uncertain whether any of it was going to be all right." Monroe looked at her. "You did not look frightened." "No," she almost smiled. "I looked at the valley instead. If I looked at the valley and decided it was good land, I could keep walking." "Was it?" he asked. "Good land?" She looked out at the south slope below them, at the hay fields gold in the evening light, at the horse pasture with the mares moving quietly, at the house behind them that was solid and warm and full. Then she looked at him. "The best land I have ever seen," she said. He reached over and took her hand, and she laced her fingers through his, and they sat on the porch in the September evening and watched the stars come out over Redemption Valley, and the feeling in Monroe Hale's chest was something he had no word large enough for. 8 years earlier, he had almost ridden past a woman walking down a road with a canvas bag and $17, and a will that was stronger than anything he had ever encountered. He had stopped. She had let him. And from that stopping had come everything. The land and the house and the children and the life that was entirely and completely theirs, built from nothing by 2 people who had chosen, against the weight of their own histories, to trust something. In the spring of 1888, Birdie was pregnant a 3rd time, which she told Monroe on a morning in April with the particular matter-of-fact tone she used for information she had processed and accepted, and was now delivering as established fact. He received it the same way, practically, with the warmth underneath held steady and deep. This one was a boy born in October, a large, healthy, indignant baby who arrived in the world with tremendous volume and immediately began expressing opinions about the temperature and the lighting. They named him Thomas, and Samuel, now 7, regarded his new brother with the philosophical acceptance of an eldest child who has already navigated one younger sibling and knows that the terrain, while challenging, is manageable. Clara, who was 4, took one look at Thomas and announced that he was hers, a claim that Thomas, once he was old enough to have preferences, did not entirely dispute, seeming to find Clara's proprietorial energy reassuring rather than oppressive. The family settled into its new configuration with the organic flexibility that families develop when the people inside them are paying attention to each other, making adjustments, noticing what is needed, being present. Monroe and Birdie had long since moved past the early vigilance of new partnership into something more comfortable and more profound, the kind of intimacy that does not require constant management, because it has become the natural atmosphere in which both people breathe. They argued sometimes because both of them were strong-willed and direct and had genuine opinions about things. The arguments were productive, usually, the kind that clarified rather than damaged. They had learned each other's patterns and could generally tell the difference between a real disagreement and the friction of tiredness or stress, and that distinction mattered. Monroe had not fully resolved his quiet nightmares, but they had diminished, and the ones that came were met by Birdie's steady presence without dramatics. She did not make it into something larger than it was. She did not make it smaller than it was either. She simply acknowledged it and let him be what he was, which was what he had always tried to do for her. By 1890, Monroe Hale was 38 years old and Birdie was 36, and the south slope above Redemption Valley had been entirely transformed from the abandoned, brush-choked 40 acres Birdie had filed on 11 years earlier into something that visitors described, accurately, as the finest small operation in the county. The horse breeding was the recognized center of it, with Monroe's reputation extending throughout northern Colorado and into Wyoming. The hay operation had consolidated and specialized, focusing on a higher quality product that commanded better prices. The house was large and solid, with 2 more rooms added on the east side to accommodate the growing family, and the porch where Monroe and Birdie sat in the evenings was the exact shape Birdie had imagined when she stood on the slope in the first winter and thought about what this land could become. Samuel was 9 and spent every available hour either with the horses or reading the agricultural journals Birdie ordered from Denver, sometimes both simultaneously in a way that resulted in the journals being returned with hoof prints on them. He was a serious, capable boy who was already developing the specific patience with animals that was his father's most identifiable gift, and Monroe watched him handle the horses and thought, without sentimentality but with deep feeling, there he goes. Clara was 7 and attended the school with the enthusiasm of a person for whom learning is primarily a social activity to be enjoyed alongside friends. She was bright, quick, social, empathetic, and entirely convinced of her own correctness on most subjects, which her teacher, a young woman named Miss Alcott, managed with more skill and less visible exhaustion than Monroe might have predicted. Thomas was 2 and was conducting an ongoing scientific investigation of what could be climbed, what could be picked up, what could be eaten, and what happened when you put those 3 categories together. He had a robust relationship with consequence, learning from each incident with the cheerful resilience of a child who finds the world primarily interesting rather than dangerous. It was a full life. It was the fullest life Monroe had ever imagined for himself, and there were days, standing in the horse pasture in the morning with the dew still on the grass and the mountains visible in every direction, when he was simply struck still by the size of what it had become, this thing that had started with a woman walking down a road with a canvas bag and a will like tempered steel. In the fall of 1890, Mrs. Hennessy, who had been the first person in Redemption Valley to unconditionally take Birdie's side, died of a heart failure in her sleep. She was 63 years old and had run the Hennessy store for 22 years and was, in every meaningful sense, the social heart of the valley. Her funeral was attended by every family who had ever lived in Redemption Valley, and Birdie gave a eulogy that was quiet and direct and true, the way Birdie did everything, and there was not a dry eye in the church when she finished. Afterward, Monroe and Birdie walked back up the slope to their house in the late afternoon, the children ahead of them on the path, and Birdie was quiet for a long time in the particular way she was quiet when something was working its way through her. "She was the first person who chose to trust me," Birdie said finally. "Without knowing me, without evidence, she just chose it. She was a person of good instincts," Monroe said. "Yes." A pause. "I want to be that for someone, the way she was for me." "You already are," he said. "For any number of women in this valley who have come to you the way you came to her." She looked at him. "I suppose that is true." "It is true," he said. They walked the rest of the way in comfortable silence, the autumn light golden on the hay fields, the horses moving in the pasture below the house, the children's voices ahead on the path. Thomas had stumbled and Clara had taken his hand without being asked, and was towing him forward with the brisk efficiency of a sister who has places to be and a little brother who slows things down considerably. Monroe and Birdie reached the porch and stood there for a moment before going inside, looking out over what they had made. 11 years since a woman had walked down a road from the northern pass with nothing. 11 years since he had almost ridden past. 11 years of choosing, again and again, to stand beside each other's lives rather than in front of them or behind them, to build something that was genuinely theirs and not a copy of someone else's pattern. The valley below was lit by the last of the afternoon. The town with its proper school and its small bank and its expanded general store and its rebuilt town council, all of it changed and changing, the living evidence of what a community becomes when it manages to be honest about who it is. Drummond was in Denver, where the federal inquiry had concluded in 1883 with findings that had cost him his political career and a significant portion of his fortune, though not, it had to be said, his freedom, the law of the time being more protective of men of property than justice would have preferred. He was old now and diminished and no longer anyone's threat. The valley had moved on. Monroe thought about what he had said in the Copper Penny Saloon in June of 1879, in the lamplight with the whole room watching. She came to this valley with nothing, and she owed nobody a single thing. He had meant it as a defense, as a statement of what was true against Drummond's manufactured claim. He had not known then how much more it would come to mean. She had come with nothing. And from nothing she had built 40 acres and a house, and a hay operation and a horse breeding reputation, and a community of trust, and 3 children, and a marriage that was the most honest and sustaining thing Monroe had ever been part of. She had built it from nothing because nothing, to Birdie Hayes, had never meant nowhere to go. It had meant freedom. It had meant owing nothing to anyone's expectations of who she should be or what she should want or how much space she was allowed to take up. She had come to this valley free, and she had built her freedom into something permanent and beautiful and real. And Monroe Hale had been lucky enough to be standing at the side of the road when she came down from the northern pass, and lucky enough to stop, and lucky enough to have sense enough to offer a ride without making it a transaction. He put his arm around her shoulders on the porch in the autumn evening, and she leaned into him the way she had learned to lean without losing her balance, the way 2 people lean when they have learned that depending does not diminish you but holds you up, and the valley spread below them in the gold and amber of the season, and everything was exactly, precisely, completely right. "Come inside," Birdie said. "Thomas is going to climb the kitchen shelves if we leave him unattended for another 5 minutes." "He probably already has." "Probably." She turned toward the door, glanced back at him with those clear winter sky eyes that had never once stopped making him feel seen. "Come on, Monroe." He followed her inside, into the warmth and the noise and the beautiful, overwhelming fullness of the life they had made. And the door closed behind him on the evening, and the lights in the windows of the house on the south slope shone out over Redemption Valley like something that had always been there and always would be, steady and bright, and entirely their own.